Hello and welcome to another episode of Gardenside Chats. I'm Billy Polanski, and today we are here at the City of Columbia compost demonstration site over at Capon Park. And today we're going to talk about composting at home. So why would you compost? That is a really good question. It's easier just to throw food maybe in your garbage disposal or in a trash can, but there's a lot of good reasons why we would want to compost. The first is sort of environmental. A lot of what is in our landfills is organic matter and food scraps and can be composted. And what is contained in our food scraps is, there's nutrients in there which can go back into the ground. But once we put them in the landfill, we sort of lose that nutrition, and it becomes contaminated. We can't put it back into the ground, into the soil. So, it's important to, it's a type of recycling really, is to capture those food scraps in our compost pile, and then we can reuse them in our gardens and in our yards. A really selfish reason to compost is that food scraps make your trash stinky. Since I've been composting, I don't have stinky trash. My trash doesn't stink. There's not flies coming out of it and stuff. And sometimes when I'm around a trash can where there isn't composting, I forget how gross stinky trash can be. And it's something that I've taken for granted, that when you separate out that food waste because you're going to compost it, you can really avoid having stinky trash in your house. So really, there's a lot of good reasons to compost, and we encourage it at CCUA. It was one of the kind of activities that we first started doing, and that we continue to do, because having healthy soil is sort of foundational for having a healthy garden and being a healthy person with the food you eat. So let's talk about where you would want to compost. So, or let me back up. Sort of composting, we're talking about food scraps, we're talking about any organic matter, so like leaves or grass clippings, anything that was once alive will rot. And so composting really is allowing that rot to happen in a really controlled way, and in a way that isn't stinky, like people might think it would be, doesn't have to necessarily be ugly or unsightly, but we're controlling it. We're taking a natural process that happens as this food breaks down by different bacteria and fungus and invertebrates, and doing it in a really controlled manner. And so really the biggest component of that at your home is taking your food scraps and getting them in a compost pile. So for me, I always would want to put my compost pile near my garden or where I'm going to use it. So I wouldn't put it right next to my house, but I'd maybe put it not too far away from your house, because if you're carrying your food scraps to your compost pile, you don't want it to be too far away where it's inconvenient. You also maybe don't want it too close. But really, you can put it where it's going to be convenient for you, and near the garden is a pretty good place, because that's probably where you're going to use it. Compost, I typically like to put compost in a more shady spot. So it doesn't, unlike plants, it does not need full sun. So you can put it in a shady corner of your yard, or maybe along the edge of your property. That'll help retain some of the moisture in the pile. It won't evaporate out too much, and it will also allow you to maximize some of your other space in your yard for gardening and things like that. So you can put it in a shady spot that's nearby your garden would be ideal. You have to think if you have dogs or if you have pets, you probably want to put your compost pile in a place where your pets aren't gonna get into that. And so we're going to talk about different types of compost piles here in a bit, and you can design your compost bin to be animal proof. Well, nothing is animal proof, but you can design it to keep your dogs out and maybe keep your cats out. As for raccoons and other possums and other critters, you may not be able to keep them out, but they have to eat too. So let's consider that. So the reason that we're doing this here today at the City of Columbia Compost Demonstration Site at Cape and Park is that there are some great different examples of compost bins for you to look at when if you're thinking about maybe you want to have compost in your backyard. So we're going to walk around and look at some of these different examples of compost bins, and we can talk about some of the pros and some of the cons. After we look at the bins, we'll talk about sort of how to compost, talk about some of the timeline of composting and how composting works a little bit more. But for right now, let's just get a visual on some of the options you have to do composting. So right behind me here, we have, this is a wood and wire 3 compost bin. So you'll see that some of these bins are just a single, and some of these have multiple bins. What's nice about having multiple bins is that when you fill one up, compost takes time, and so when you fill one up, you can move on to the next one, and probably by the time you fill the next one up, you can start pulling fresh compost or finished compost out of the first one, and then you can just sort of move through. You can have ones that you're adding to, ones that are actively composting and breaking down, and then you can have one that you are harvesting the compost from. This one is nice. It's made out of 2x4 and 1x lumber, and then there's some nice hardware cloth along the outside. This would be a really good option for pet owners because it's going to keep your pets out. Really, probably the fanciest feature about this is these slats in the front. So depending on how large or how tall your compost pile gets, you can add more of these slats in, and then when you're ready to harvest the compost from there, you can pull the slats out so that it is easy to remove the compost. So you can take the slats out so that there's really no front at all, or you can stack it up real high. So this is it's aesthetically pleasing, but I would say the downside to this one is that it is a little bigger, and you're going to have to have an upfront cost to purchase these materials, the hardware cloth and the lumber and screws and things like that. Let's look over here at this one. This is a manufactured compost bin. It's made out of plastic. It's a pretty tidy setup. It's pretty self-contained. You add to the top, and they have these little doors at the bottom where you can lift up and harvest the compost from the bottom. I'm not really a fan of these ones. It's just kind of a plastic thing in your yard. So personally, this doesn't fit my aesthetic, but it is tidy, which might be what you're going for. This is also a downside of this is something that you would have to purchase. You see these at your local hardware stores, but so we've got the soil saver here. Another example right here. This is made of landscape timbers. You see how they are just sort of stacked, alternating. It leaves some, there's some slats in the side, which sort of let some airflow in. So this is something you can build the compost pile. You can build the sides of it as your pile gets larger. This might be something you're able to do with some landscaping timbers you have laying around your house, or some other lumber, or it may be some material that you need to purchase. We come over here. This is a similar version to the 3-bin system we were just looking at. We've got some 2x4 lumber here that's screwed together. We've got the hardware cloth on the sides, which sort of lets some airflow in and lets the water out. But what they have here is, I don't know if you can see, but this edge right here, there's a hinge, and then there's these 2 little latches. So you can add to the top, and then when it's time to harvest the pile, you just flip these latches up. You can open the door, and it's pretty easy to harvest from there. We've got another one here. This is the GeoBin. I believe that the City of Columbia, through their composting program, gives these away sometimes at certain events. It's essentially a piece of fabric that you can wrap around fence posts or things like that. It's got holes in the side, so let some airflow in, and it just kind of, it makes a circular shape. Or if you, in this case, it's circular, but if you had 4 fence posts, you could make it square. I think this is a lower cost system, especially if you can get the side part from the city through their composting program. And what's nice about this is it's adjustable too, so you can make it wider or skinnier as well. We're going to look at one more here. Get this out of the way. So this is the Pallet system. These are pretty common. I feel like these are pretty easy to put together. If you can find some pallets, you can also often find them for free. You just stick a bunch of pallets together and you make the system like this. These ones have the fronts that are open. You can also put pallets on the front to close it off. But what's nice about these is, this is practically free. You notice that this one there are some fence posts, some little U posts here that are kind of helping to stabilize it. But you can also make these without the U posts. Something this size, especially if you have pallets on the front, it'll pretty much hold itself together. And then once you get the compost filling the inside, you don't necessarily always need that. So really, if you had some pallets and some screws, you could have yourself a free compost bin. These I feel like these are pretty common. CCUA has built a lot of these, and really I think these a lot of times are sort of like, they embody composting, because composting is about recycling and reusing materials and using old pallets like this. It doesn't cost any money. It really is. It embodies composting by using the pallets. There's another way, which is not demonstrated here, but it's a A really easy way to do it is not to have a bin at all. So you could you can just make a pile. You can decide this is where my pile's going, and put it there. Aesthetically, it's not as nice. It's hard to know where it stops and where it ends, but of course, you can just make a pile. Composting is a natural process. Organic material is going to rot, and so it doesn't need to be in a bin to rot. It will do that naturally, but it's about how we control it, how fast we want it to happen, how is it convenient for us to add to the pile and to take from it when the compost is finished. So let me stand back over here since we've done our tour of composting. And Matthew, can you help me out by
Set that back up for you.
setting my notes back up for me? So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. There really isn't a wrong way to compost. And so what you want to add into your compost piles, you hear a lot. We talked about food scraps, livestock, manure and litter and bedding, like if you have chickens in your backyard, or if you can access cow manure or horse manure, those are great to add into your compost pile. Any plant material from your yard or from your garden, so grass clippings, leaves and things like that, all of these things will break down and will make a nice nutritious product for your garden. We try to categorize what we compost in kind of two main categories. We think of them as our greens and our browns, or our high nitrogen items and our high carbon items. And you want to have a nice mixture of these in order to control that breakdown process to create a nice composting end product. So our greens or our high nitrogen items, those are, I think of those as the stinky things. So food scraps, maybe grass clippings or manure. Those things, if you had a pile of food scraps sitting there by itself, it'd be kind of stinky. Or even grass clippings, it can get kind of stinky. Manure we know is stinky. And so those are your greens. And so in order to have a nice end product, and honestly for your compost pile not to stink, because it does not have to. Food scraps by themselves can stink, but compost does, when done correctly, does not stink. So you want to balance those green items or your high nitrogen items with high carbon items or your browns. So those include things like dead leaves or straw or sawdust, things like that. You can use wood mulch. So those items are going to balance out the nitrogen, and your compost will break down into a balanced product. Now, if you start researching compost, you'll see that there's like certain ratios of nitrogen and carbon that are ideal. Don't worry about those things for your backyard compost, because it is nearly impossible for you to calculate that on your own. Really, what I try to balance is covering your green items with brown items so that they don't stink. And if you do that, it will rot. Try not to get caught up, because there's a lot of information. Try not to get caught up in the detail and the nuance. This is a very easy thing. Leaves in the woods, if you're walking through the woods, leaves are going to rot on the ground. Tree trunks are going to rot on the ground. Fallen fruit is going to rot on the ground. All of these things happen naturally. And for you in your backyard, if you can keep it from stinking, you're probably doing a good job, and it's going to rot. So when making compost in your bin or in your pile, I like to think of it as making a lasagna. so you've got layers. So at my house, we have a bucket that sits next to our kitchen sink. It's like a little ice cream bucket. And so I'm putting in there food scraps, so table scraps of things that didn't get eaten, or potato peels, eggshells, coffee grounds, all of that stuff gets added in this bucket. When the bucket gets full, I'll bring it back to my compost pile, and I'm going to dump it on top of the pile. That stuff, if you just leave it to sit there, is going to get stinky. So, we're making a lasagna. So the first layer is those greens, those food scraps from my kitchen, and then I'm going to cover it with either some leaves or some straw, or something that we like to use also is horse bedding from Stevens College. Their stables, they have sawdust bedding that they keep in the horse stables. There is manure mixed in there too, but there's a lot of sawdust, and it is heavier in carbon than it is in nitrogen. So we use that horse bedding as our brown layer to cover up the food scraps. And so it's just that simple. When you get enough food scraps to dump in, to carry out and dump in your pile, you bring them out there, you dump it, and then you cover it. And so dump and cover, and then it just sort of layers in your pile like a lasagna. There is a lot of people who they'll turn their compost piles. If you research composting, say, oh geez, it sounds like a lot of work because you have to turn your pile. You have to get a shovel or a pitchfork out, and you have to mix it all together and flip it and turn it. And you can turn your pile. If you turn your pile, it will make the composting process happen faster. You'll have a more uniform and consistent product. It is also a lot of work, and like I said, if you just leave it there, it will rot. These are organic materials. They will break down when left out. And so it's if you want it to happen faster, then you can turn your compost pile. If you don't need it to happen as fast, or you don't really care, just put it there and just set it and forget it, like a crock pot. Lasagna in a crock pot. That's really all that composting is. So whether you turn it or don't turn it, there's no right or wrong way. These things will rot.
We've got a question here.
Okay, we have a question.
Can I compost twigs and branches?
Great question. Can I compost twigs and branches? So typically, I would advise against composting twigs and branches. They take longer to break down, and can make it difficult to scoop out your compost when it's ready. Because if your leaves and your food scraps have broken down into a really nice fine product, your twigs and stuff, they might not be broken down for another 6 months or a year. They're going to take longer. Now, like I said, everything will rot. So if you leave it there long enough, it will break down. But I would not put leaves and branches in my compost pile just because they don't break down as fast. Now, some people too, I've seen folks who try to chop up their food scraps into really small pieces, or try to chop or decimate it into smaller pieces. For food scraps and for straw and leaves and things like that, you do not have to do that. But twigs and branches, because, and we'll get to this in a second, because those have lignins, which is sort of like it's in branches and twigs that kind of gives them their strength. Those take longer to break down, and and is not as ideal if you're trying to put the compost in your garden. So quickly, there's kind of 4 phases of composting, and in your compost pile, these 4 phases can be happening in different parts of the pile at different times, because sort of as you add, there's kind of different time frame. At the very bottom could be 6 months old when you're still adding to the top of the pile. So your first phase is what is called a mesophilic phase, and essentially what that means is that in there the process is starting to happen, and the temperature of the pile is the temperature is pretty much the temperature of the outdoors. And so in here there are bacteria that are starting to break things down, and those are the bacteria that we are very familiar with, that live in our world, which is between right now it's 70 degrees, that live in this temperature range. And so those get started, and then eventually there is so much activity, there is so much, that bacteria is doing so much work. With the kids, we call it a microbe dance party. And so there's all these people, there's all this bacteria, and they're working, and in the dance party, in the dance hall, it's getting hot, and the temperature starts to rise. And the temperature gets to a point where other bacteria that are not present typically in our normal temperatures, those bacteria show up, and that's a thermophilic phase of composting. Compost piles, I've seen, when they peak, they can peak around 160 degrees. Now, obviously, there's not really places here in Missouri that get 160 degrees, so we don't really see these bacteria, but they sort of lay dormant, and they're ready for the rot, for the composting to happen, and those thermophilic bacteria come in, and when it's that hot, they can come in and start breaking things down. At a certain point, the party's over. All the bacteria sort of go home, and things start to cool down. And that's usually when you'll see things like fungus come in. And the fungus, those are going to break down the lignins, those fibers that you'll see maybe in wood mulch or in some of your straw or leaves. So that's when the fungus come in and start to break those things down. And then the last phase of compost is just curing. And really what's happening is that things just kind of balance out. There's not as much activity. There's maybe some bugs coming in. And that happens, I guess, in the cool down phase too, is your invertebrates come in, your roly-polies and ants and things like that, and kind of break the bigger pieces down when things cool down. But that'll happen in your curing phase too. And it's really important, you want to give it time to cure. Your compost might look like it's finished after maybe 3, 4, or 5 months, but really, in order for it to kind of stabilize a little bit, ideally your compost is going to sit for 6 months to a year, and that's going to depend on if you're turning it or if you're just leaving it. But you want to give it that time to cure, because it may actually be detrimental to your garden at first if it's not fully cured when you add it. So because of that timing, that it can take 6 months to a year to get all the way through that process and all the way through that curing. And that's why when we talked about before the multi-bin system, having more than one bin can ensure that you have a pile that you're adding to, you have a pile that's been added to, but is you're not adding to anymore and it's breaking down, and you could have a third pile that you are harvesting from to put in your garden. And so here's the thing about composting in your backyard though. If you're mostly relying on the food scraps that come from your house, it is not going to be a tremendous amount of compost. It is really going to depend on you adding additional materials in there to bulk it up to get any kind of substantial amount. First of all is that when things compost, they shrink down. Piles, when you initially add to them, can go to be about 50% to a third of the size of what you originally added. And so your compost, you might keep adding it and your pile might look like it's consistently the same size. That's because as you add, the composting process breaks things down and condenses. So I would recommend that in addition to the food scraps that you're adding, that you, if you have like a lot of leaves that you rake from your yard, make sure you add all those leaves. Go to Stevens College and get some of that horse bedding that can really bulk it up. If you have maybe chickens, you can add chicken manure or chicken bedding into the pile. If you have a farmer with cows or goats or llamas or things like that, you can add really, or rabbits, any kind of livestock manure can be added to bulk up your pile. I want to talk a little bit about some do's and don'ts with composting. We're talking about manure. You really do not want to add your pet's manure to the pile. So if your pet, dog poop, cat poop, kitty litter, don't put that stuff in the pile. Carnivorous animals, they have different bacteria and things going on in their guts, and it's not ideal for your compost pile. You don't really want to put that in your garden. Some of the types of things that you do want to add, like I said, would be food scraps. You can add vegetable and fruit peelings and cores. You can add eggshells, coffee grounds, even like some paper. So like if you like coffee filters and things like that. Something that I like to add is pizza boxes, because cardboard pizza boxes, when they get all that grease on them, you cannot recycle them because they've been contaminated with that grease. But that cardboard will break down, and that grease in there is compostable too. So we throw pizza boxes in our compost. Really any paper product can be composted. So a hotly debated item is whether or not to put meat and dairy products in your compost. I'm here at the city's composting site, and I know their sign here says not to add meat or dairy. I add meat and dairy. I've never had a problem. It always breaks down. The only thing is that it may attract critters. You may get an extra raccoon or something coming to go through your compost pile. But it's an organic material. It will rot. It will break down. But that's up to you if that's something you want to do or not. I think it's totally fine. Other people don't. You could maybe do some research on that for yourself. If your pile's getting too stinky, add some more of that brown material. Add some leaves. You want to make sure that your pile gets air. So you saw a lot of these models here have air slats in the side that they're sitting directly on the ground. You don't necessarily want it to be in a low spot where water would collect, because that could be bad. So you want it to, but shady is nice, because you want the pile to be moist, but you don't want it to be soaking wet, because moisture, as we know, water is sort of one of the foundations of life, and so for all of that breakdown, those bacteria and those fungus to function, they do need to be moist. In a particularly drought year or dry year, you may think about watering your compost pile, but I think typically that's probably not something you have to think about. So I think I've covered everything. Matthew, have I missed anything?
I think you've done a good job.
All right.
One of the most important things.
All right, so these are just kind of the big parts of composting. Of course, there's worm composting, which is a whole nother topic, which we've done before, and we may do at another time.
Maybe how to use your compost when it's done, how to apply it, and how it benefits your garden as you apply it.
Yeah. Okay. So here's maybe something glaring that I didn't cover was how to use your compost when it's done. Do we maybe want to come over to one of these piles and we can look at some finished compost? I was thinking so much about the process that I didn't think about the end product. So right here we have some finished compost. You can see it's nice and crumbly. There's worms in there. It's you really wouldn't be able to know that this used to be like onion peels and leaves and things like that. It's a very nice fine product. It does not smell. What it smells like is soil or like a potting mix you would get from the garden center. And so that is what the end product should look like. And when you add this to your garden, it will not only add organic matter because it has so much carbon in it, which for our clay soils here in Missouri will really help break up a lot of the compaction we see with clay soils. The organic matter does that. But it will also add nitrogen, which is something that your plants need to grow. And there's lots of, depending on what you put in it, there's other micronutrients as well. Like if you're putting eggshells in your compost, well then there's going to be extra calcium in there. And so every batch of compost is different. So depending on what you add, if you're adding eggshells versus you're not adding eggshells, or if you're adding leaves versus maybe cow manure, there's just lots of different ways. So I can't say what is in compost, but all compost does have carbon and nitrogen, and these are really great. So when you put this in your garden, maybe you want to spread it out, like maybe spread out an inch of it or a couple inches of it over your garden, and you can incorporate it in with like a shovel or a potato fork or maybe a tiller. It's also something nice, like it's almost time to plant your tomatoes. Mother's Day is on Sunday, and then Mother's Day is sort of like the holiday we use as a benchmark for time to plant tomatoes. And so when you're planting your tomatoes this Sunday with your mom, you can just take a little handful of that compost and put it at the bottom of the hole you dig to plant that tomato in the ground. So you can dig it in with your transplants. You can what we call side dress crops with compost, and that would just be you can just kind of put it next to where you've already planted something. And so compost is something that you can really add at any time. Something to think about is if you think you have compost but it hasn't cured yet, that's something that you maybe add in the fall to start in the spring with your spring garden. So you can really add it at any time of the year. It's going to help build your soil. It's going to help break up those fine clay particles, which get just really compacted. And so spread it out and incorporate it. Put it in your transplants. Side dress it. You can do a lot with your compost. And yeah, I think that's it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments, or I'd recommend anybody to come out here to Capon Park and look at the city's compost demonstration site. There's some nice inspiration here for things you could do in your backyard. They've got some nice signage, and they offer composting classes periodically. I'm sure when things come back to normal, we'll start offering those composting classes again. So thank you all for tuning in today to another episode of Garden Side Chats. Remember to like, plant, and subscribe, and we will see you on Monday.